the agrarian crisis that has hit many Indian states, the centre has been seeking to integrate the National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme with agriculture in an institutional manner. In a recent interview, CNBC TV18's Shereen Bhan asked Vice Chairman of the Niti Aayog, Arvind Panagariya, if more was needed to be done with the scheme. Here's what he had to say.
I would also like to see some changes happen in the scheme itself so that the asset creation aspect is strengthened. Today it's relatively weak. So we should do that. But yes, I think alongside we do need right now the rural expenditures to rise because that's where the demand has been tapped.
On that subject of rural distress and whether NDA's rural policy is any different from that of the UPA, I'm now joined by Abhijit Sen, former member of the Planning Commission. Good evening very much, Mr. Sen, and thank you very much for joining us here on The Big Picture. Now, when the NDA government had come to power, we all remember that there was a lot of skepticism, especially about the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme. But it appears that there is renewed focus on this all of a sudden. Well, just to give you some data, sir, between August and September 2015, there was 71 crore man-days of work generated. That is considerably higher than the 40.5 crore work that was generated in the same quarter in 2014. The government yesterday also announced higher payments under the scheme. So therefore, sir, do you interpret this as an acknowledgement by the government finally of the inherent strengths of the NREGA scheme?
Well, let me put it this way. I think let's not go into the past. Let's simply acknowledge that the government, at least in terms of its priorities, given the conditions that are today, has recognized that amongst the instruments it has to deal with some of the problems that it feels are there, has actually decided to use the existing instruments. And of course, I mean, the point is that the NREGA rebound this year is really from a base which was low in 2014, it was low in 2015, even lower. It's rebounded from there. So one shouldn't make too much of it, especially given that we've had 2 consecutive years of drought. But it's fairly clear that given that there is again a renewed rural distress, there's utility in the NREGA, whoever might have started it.
Fair enough, Professor. But then, would you therefore do you feel therefore that there has been any radical departure by the NDA government as far as its rural policy is concerned vis-a-vis the UPA?
No, let's put again. I think you were right. I think when the NDA came to power, I think there was, on the part of the NDA, and I think also on the part of a lot of other people, that the UPA may well have carried the social sector safety nets too far and ignored, investment in infrastructure and growth and things. Now, a part of that was just swings of the pendulum, but pendulum swings, okay? And so they swing irrespective of whether you are in government, whether there is a change in government. Of course, the swings are much larger when there is a change in government. But pendulums by their nature swing. And I think what is being recognized is that we still have a lot of people in rural areas. We still depend on a rural demand for a lot of industry, and that monsoons still cause a huge amount of problem. And under those circumstances, safety nets become important. Under those circumstances, social sector spending of various kinds become important, because it's not enough to construct a road, it's also important to actually have education and things. Now, the government still, I think, is way behind the curve on social sectors, in part because the government has, following the 14th Finance Commission, in a sense transferred all those responsibility to the states. and the states are basically saying that, look here, you should be doing more. I mean, so there is a distribution problem there between levels of government, but I think we are seeing that, there is a swing back to somewhere, not probably where we were in 2013, but somewhere towards that direction, yeah.
That's an important point you're making, Professor. Therefore, you're saying that post the 14th Finance Commission recommendations, which clearly sort of suggested that the centre should share a higher burden of the revenue with the state government. So now the burden of responsibility as far as making those investments in healthcare and education is concerned now lies mainly with the states.
Yeah, it does. I mean, I think these are all areas in which the Constitution makes it fairly clear that they are responsibilities of the state, and I think what the 14th Finance Commission ended up doing was to back that responsibility with a fiscal devolution of a fairly sizable amount.
Allow me to persist with this point a little more, so especially with respect to NREGA, because when Narendra Modi had come to power, he had promised an alternative development agenda for the rural sector, which was to move away from a redistributive model to more addressing issues at the supply side. But do you think that the rural distress now that we are seeing in 280 districts across India has forced him now to reassess that approach, evidence in the higher payout to MNREGA?
Well, there are 2 points here. The first is that finally it's a legal responsibility. It's a law, the NREGA. And providing jobs to those who want it and don't have, more than 100 days of work is something which the government is legally required to do. So in a sense, the government is simply playing its legal role, because otherwise, if you wanted to change that, you would have to change the law, which of course is, political hot potato. But there's a second point as well, which is under the circumstances that we've been through in the last 2 years, I think people are also recognizing that NREGA, quite apart from being a safety net or a redistributive program, can and has worked as an investment. I mean, there's a lot of ponds and things, and it's fairly clear that where NREGA has worked well, the drought has affected matters much less. Don't forget that the design of the NREGA is basically investments in soil and water.
Talking a little bit about whether NDA government has a rural strategy in place, because as far as its manufacturing approach is concerned, one understands with the Make in India campaign, and there's clearly, there is a focus on the part of the government. But when you look at NDA's agricultural policy, do you see any coherence in that, sir?
Frankly, no. Because I don't think, with the exception of 1 or 2 areas, I mean, this Prime Minister's Sinchai Yojana and the announcement yesterday of a new insurance scheme, which I don't really know the details about, it's more or less, in fact, all of these also are more or less continuation of where we've been before. The difference, of course, is that again there have been large cuts in several existing government programs, and the states are supposed to pick it up. Now, the lack of coherence, and I do think there is a lack of coherence, is in part because I think once you have sort of decided that this is the responsibility of the state, the centre's attitude towards agriculture changes. However, I think the seriousness of the issue is now, I think, coming back to the government, and I think the task to work out is to work more effectively with the states, because again, it's the states who will have to do it, and to reward states who make investments, to help states who do not have enough money to do so, and of course there's the whole area of technology, which is a national thing. It cannot be done by the states themselves, that is research and development. are things which focus is necessary.
Then do you feel, sir, that there could be a correlation then between Make in India and the rural distress? Because if the rural distress is not resolved, at least the problems that we are facing, then Make in India too could be in jeopardy. In that sense, there is a clear sort of correlation between the two.
Oh, well, the point is this, that, it's still the case that more than 2/3 of Indians still live in rural areas. Now, they're not all doing agriculture, so don't confuse agriculture with rural. But even in agriculture, little less than half of the workforce is still in agriculture. Now, this workforce, however, is producing only about 14% of GDP. So it's a poor part of the workforce in some sense. Now, clearly, in terms of their total demand, they won't be able to demand more than their share of the income. But that's something which is not insignificant. And in a lot of quick-moving consumer items, and in fact in a lot of lower-end consumer items, this is the growing market. Because people tend to forget that Indians still lack many basic things, and a little bit of income makes them buy those things. And numbers matter. Number of people matter as much as number of amount of money they have.
Well then, sir, would you then say that owing to the fact that 280 districts in India have been hit by drought, the government has little option then but to use the union budget, which is going to be announced on the 29th of February, to specifically focus on sprucing up the rural demand that you're talking about?
Well, I don't know what they'll do in the union budget. I think there are limits to a union budget. And I think droughts will come and go. And I think hopefully with 2 droughts already in succession, the weather will turn better. So next year will not be a drought. It will probably be a very good agricultural year. But nonetheless, I think the fact is that you've got to prepare for contingencies. And I think the insurance thing is a good step forward, but insurance is only part of the situation. And that's as far as agriculture is concerned. Let's also not forget that in rural areas, people now earn more than half their income, considerably more than half their income, from non-agricultural activities. And bringing even Make in India to rural areas is really something which any government ought to be doing. That is, make rural non-agricultural employment, rural non-agricultural incomes the basis of growth. I think where people tend to get a bit misled by this is the low share of agriculture in GDP.
Thank you very much, Professor Abhijit Sen, for joining us on that big story. Of course, rural distress will continue to be a focus here on CNBC TV 18. Remember, we've had 2 back-to-back droughts, but in the last 100 years, there's never been a situation that there have been 3 back-to-back droughts. So let's hope and pray that it does not happen.